1 plus 1 equals 3. The key theme here is thirdness, and not simply in the Peircean sense of mediation. For Lacan, the gappy differential relation between any two entities or events that allows them to appear as distinct, relatable entities or events, this third element that is their differential relation, is also our point of access to the real. Not the real itself, but its point of access, its doorstep, indeed its threshold. Just ask your feet. Last time we ended with your hands and all the touching they do. Now I want to begin with your feet, mine as well, and all the toeing they get into. We don't just think with our feet, as Lacan would later say. We touch upon the real, or at least its threshold, with our feet as well. You see, in truth, love, language, discourse, and language and discourse are not the same. Add psychoanalysis, in all of these arenas, thirdness prevails. And don't get me started on the big O other, the world, the cosmos, the universe, and all the other fictions by which we cling to visions of the one, of oneness, of wholeness, and the like, in the face of multiplicity. Lo, reality, ever the grimace of the real we love to ignore, in search of stupid angelic smiles instead, and not stupid in the good way. You see, there's a good way to be an idiot and a dumb way to be an idiot. There's a good way to be dumb and a bad way. You see, stupidity, like ignorance, comes in varied forms. Here we're talking about those stupid angelic smiles, not the grimace of the real. I don't think there's a greater fiction out there than reality. Kind of a cliche, but one Lacan has got his finger on here in the winter of 1973. There is no greater fiction than reality, because it's reality that steers us from the grimace of the real. But I didn't come here to traffic in that particular cliche. I've got others, in fact, that we want to talk about. That's not what we're here to do. It's analytic experience as a field of thirdness which holds a place for the real that concerns us here, Lacan as well. The bottom half of Lacan's matheme for analytic discourse is a great place to study thirdness in the clinic. And we've got the blackboard up, so I'm going to draw for you the analytic discourse. And note this bottom bit. It takes a minute to get it all up here, but there you have it. That's the analytic discourse. Note this bottom half. All we can do is put a placeholder in. There is no vector between S2 and S1. This is a great place to study thirdness in the clinic. That S1, that symptomatic statement that you see here in the position of product in the analytic discourse, it really says it all. The symptomatic statement, no matter what yours sounds like and how it differs from mine, it says the same thing. I'm the part of this subject's unconscious truth that can be said. But there's another part of their unconscious truth which cannot be said, which defies expression, to say nothing of deciphering. And I'm powerless to say anything more about it. This is a common refrain in our work, following Lacan's lead, since about Seminar 19B or worse. You've heard it from me before. It's still holding truth here. Between the symptom and its unconscious beyond, there is an irreducible gap, an irremovable barrier, an insurmountable mountain, which is why, again, I still like to use that delta of impotence from Seminar 17 between truth and product in Lacan's mathemes for discourse. That delta of impotence does a good job of marking for us this irremovable barrier here between S2 and S1, unconscious truth and symptomatic statement in analytic discourse. You want a name for it, something better than the delta of impotence? Call it what Lacan is increasingly calling it, a non-rapport. This is where we discover the non-rapport. In fact, if you take a careful look at the opening sessions of Seminar 20, as we did in our last series, this is what you see. The entire analytic discourse is structured around this non-rapport between unconscious truth and symptomatic statement. That little triangle here between S2 and S1 marks that place. The place of a non-rapport between symptom and unconscious. Here is our third, the third which allows us to say that S1 and S2, S1 plus S2 equals 3. What do you know? 1 plus 2 sometimes does equal 3. And often, however, several more than 3. Now, in Seminar 17, Lacan marks this spot again with a little triangle, a delta of impotence. That's what it is. It's a sign of impotence. In this case, the powerlessness and incapacity of the symptom to ever fully account for unconscious truth. That's what he means by impotence here. It's not about detumescence. It's fundamentally about incapacity. He's thinking in the Greek Aristotelian sense of impotentiality, adynamia, an inability, an incapacity. S1 is unable to cross that mountain range into the unconscious. By the end of Seminar 19b, or worse, Lacan has upped the ante on this third variable that marks the differential relation between S1 and S2. At the end of or worse, he has raised impotence to the status of impossibility. Now it becomes a sign of the real. From impotence to impossibility, and with impossibility as a sign of the real. And this fundamentally is what's at stake in any Lacanian matheme, the first of which is his theory of discourse. It's an algorithmic structure built up around an impossibility, an impasse which functions as a point of access to the real. That is what is up with Lacanian mathematics. It's about arriving at formulaic expressions that allow us to see, visualize, mark in some way, impossibilities, impasses, insurmountable barriers that serve as thresholds for the real. They ain't the real themselves. They are the thresholds of the real. Access is a word Lacan really likes to use in this context, which is why I emphasize these as points of access to the real. The non-rapport is not the real. It is a point of access to it, which is what we're going to talk about here today. And I got to tell you, this little delta mountain range impotence raised to the level of impossibility, it ain't the only complex element on your screen right now. If you look at the lower half of the analytic discourse on display here, note that S1 again. That S1 in analytic discourse is the only S1 in any of Lacan's discourses to admit that 1 + 1 = 3. Just think about this for 1 second with me. Actually, it's going to take longer than a second, so, hang on to your fucking hats here. All of Lacan's other discourses, the hysteric, the university, the capitalist, the master, all of these other discourses are premised on the deluded, fantastical claim that 1 + 1 = 1. Everywhere we look in the discourse of the master, the hysteric, the university, and even the capitalist, we see S1s premised on the belief that there is oneness. Recall this from our last lecture. On the left-hand side, in the field of multiplicity, the properly Lacanian field, we see 1 + 1 = 3, some but not all, which we're going to talk about. On the right-hand side, though, we see this, there is oneness. A 1 + 1 = 1, a kind of funky, fuzzy math, as we discussed it. All of Lacan's other discourses are premised on the belief that there is oneness, that oneness is, except for the analytic discourse. The analytic discourse is the only discourse in which S1 admits that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 1, that 1 + 1 doesn't even equal 2. Only in the analytic discourse does S1 admit that 1 + 1 = 3. You don't believe me? You have doubts about this? Consider any and all of the other discourses, and in each case, just follow the S1. Let's start with the master, that beloved master, everywhere and nowhere. The master says, there is oneness and I am it. I switch up the colors here, but I'm drawing the master's discourse so you can see it. The form or the structure is exactly the same as that of the analytic discourse. You've known this for a while. But notice that S1 in the master's discourse is in the agential position. This is the speaker's position. And what it says is, to the other, there is oneness, motherfucker, and I am it. Here you see S1 as self. Moving on, because why the fuck not? What does the hysteric say? Well, let's draw the discourse and talk it through. The hysteric also believes that there is oneness, but here's how they say it. There is oneness and you're not it. The hysteric speaks from the position of barred subjectivity to a would-be master who purports to be one, which is why S1 is in the position of addressee in the hysteric's discourse, and forces them to confess their ignorance, their lack, their inability. What the hysteric says is, there is oneness, and you're not it. Now, this is a crucial aspect of what the hysteric is up to, because if they cannot find a wannabe master, they will make one. You know you're in the presence of a hysteric when you can tell somebody's looking for a master. Not in order to be mastered by them, but in order to take them down a peg. In order to say there is such a thing as oneness and you're not it. I've had better. The hysteric says, you're not the one. You see, this is why the hysteric is such a great illustration of how late modern logics of social protest work. You think you're the shit? Let's expose why you're not. It's a revelatory, apocalyptic logic of the protester. You see, the master gives you the classic juridical sense of power, And the hysteric gives you the classic modern figure of the protester, who shows up unhinged, challenges power, and forces it to admit that it is lacking, reveals, indeed, that the emperor is naked. We could go on about this, and we have another series, but notice this move here. Here, S1 is positioned as the other. The master positions S1 as the self, and the hysteric positions it as the other, but only in order to cut it down. There is oneness, but you're not it, the hysteric says, and so wonderfully when it goes well. Let's add the university to this. The university is cool. What's wrong with the university? Well, we're going to see about it. We've been over a lot of this, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But my point is this. If you follow the S1s in the university discourse, you see a similar logic. The university discourse is founded on a certain truth, a truth which your dear professors have a hard time admitting. We don't need to get into that now, do we? The university says there is oneness and I'm not it. Here you see S1, the position of power in that of unconscious truth. The unconscious truth of the university is that they indeed are not power because they're power's fucking mouthpiece. The secret of the professor is that they are the mouthpiece of power. That's why S1 is in the position of unconscious truth. So you see, the master sees the one as themselves. The hysteric creates a figure of the one in someone else. And the university just shows up and says, there is such a thing as oneness, but it ain't me, baby. No, I'm more in line with you, dear students. What a crock of shit. And you can tell the crock of shit every time your professor goes to cash that six-figure paycheck at the end of the year, at the end of the month, at the end of the week. They are the mouthpiece of power. Proof, indeed, of that classic Marxist point, that the ruling ideas in any given era are always the ideas of that era's ruling class. That's what we read in the university discourse. But it's all happening behind this facade of there being oneness, but not being me. The university is in a state of denial. It's a discourse of denial. There is oneness, but it ain't me. Hence, S1 as repressed, unconscious truth. I know the one you want to talk about. I know the discourse you want to talk about. It's the fucking capitalist discourse. We're going to spend some more time with this one. It's lovely, it's fun, it's wildly underdeveloped in Lacan's thoughts, so don't run too hard with this one. If you want to know how to make it, you basically take the master discourse in both hands and take your left hand and just give it a twist. Turn it upside down, just your left hand. And what you'll see is an inversion of the left-hand side of the master's discourse, but the other side remains the same. But note, because you gave it that twist, you broke the arrow of adressivity between agent and other, between speaker and auditor. Everything else remains in place. You see, the diagonal vectors didn't break when you gave it the twist, but the arrow of adressivity did. And the dilemma now is that you've got a racetrack. Notice, you can pass from barred subject to S1 to S2 to little a to barred subject to S1 to little... You can just keep going. That's the nature of capitalist discourse. It's a kind of endless, interminable process. And it is closely related to analysis astray, when analyses become interminable. We'll come to that a little later, I think. We'll see. I don't know where television's going to go from here. But I want you to just notice what the S1 is doing here. The capitalist also believes that there is oneness. But here it's oneness at the level of the commodity, at the level of the signifier, at the level of a name, a brand, a logo. There is oneness, and this might be it, the capitalist says when they buy their new BMW after trading in their Honda, after trading in their Geo, after trading in their scooter, after trading in their bike. There's always this next consumptive level, the brand or the logo of which promises to be the one. This is the one. I'm a BMW boy. I am the BMW boy because this commodity is the one. There is oneness, and the capitalist always hopes that the next commodity is indeed it. Because as you read the capitalist discourse, as we've done elsewhere, it's really clear that the capitalist always comes up short. That S1, that commodity, when packed back into the house of all the other shit you've purchased, all the other shit in your garage, that BMW eventually becomes a disappointment. At which point, your dissatisfaction is queued up again, and you're a barred subject ready to rock on to the next S1, because that one might be the one. You see? Here you see S1 as an illusory truth. Note that move. In the university discourse, S1 that says there is oneness is in the position of unconscious truth. In the case of the capitalist discourse, S1 is in the position of what I would describe as an illusory truth, because the capitalist believes that they've finally landed on the product of all products. It's an illusion. It's a mirage. You see where I'm going with this, though. Follow the S1s. The master says there is oneness, and I am it. The hysteric says there is oneness, and you're not it. The university says there is oneness, but it ain't me. And the capitalist says there is oneness, and by God, this might be it. All are premised on the belief that oneness exists, that 1 + 1 = 1. These are all discourses of the one. Only the analytic discourse is that of multiplicity. In the analytic discourse, the truth is revealed. Notice what I'm saying here, too. I told you that the S1 in the analytic discourse admits that 1 + 1 = 3. That's an admission that the other discourses can't make, even though in each of the other discourses you see, with the addition of the delta of impotence raised to impossibility, that there are indeed thirdnesses swimming through each. The master's discourse has an impossibility baked into its bottom half. That's the delta of impotence turned impossibility between barred subject as truth and little a as product. And we can just run the circuit again. We don't have time to do it, really. Plus, we've done it before. But check it out. In each case, thirdness is there, but it's not admitted. Because the focus, if you think about it, is on that S1. Only in the analytic discourse is the focus on not the first element and not indeed the second, but instead the differential relation between them. That is crucial, and that's why I write it in a different color. What then does the analyst, by way of the analysand, by way of the symptomatic statement in the shape of that S1, say to the master, the hysteric, the university, and the capitalist? The analytic discourse says to each, there is no such thing as oneness, even and especially when it appears otherwise. This is its admission. There is no such thing as oneness, even and especially when you think the opposite. Why? Because there is always also the unconscious, the analytic discourse replies, extending beyond any and all claims of oneness. And beyond the unconscious, in the field of impossibility here signaled by that little beautiful pink delta, beyond the unconscious in this pink delta, we see a mark of impossibility, which divides the unconscious from even the most symptomatic statements. Let me be clear. Beyond the unconscious, there is always the real. Now, at this point in Lacan's thought, that's a truth that holds. Now, he may later come along and want to have the real and the unconscious all mashed up into what Colette Soler smartly calls the real unconscious, but he ain't there yet. At this point, unconscious is a field of truth, and the real is something else entirely. As he says in L'Étourdi, the real is like the big sister of truth. As we put it, the sensei of truth. It bosses truth around. They are not the same at this point in the winter of 1973. Why is there no such thing as oneness? Because beyond the one, there is always the other known as the unconscious, that other place. But don't stop there, because beyond this other place, here signaled as S2, there is impossibility as a signal of the real. Symptom and unconscious divided by the real, as signaled in the delta of impotence raised to the level of an impossibility. That's it in a nutshell. This is how we read the lower half of the analytic discourse. Note, that's not one and not just two elements in the lower half of the analytic discourse. It's three. So much the worse for psychologists, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, and all the other psycho-so-and-sos, as Lacan dubs them at the start of Section 3 of Television. To this list as well, crucially so, we must add all those analysts astray, as you've heard me call them, all of whom Yersin, as Badiou so well puts it, for the same as these psycho-so-and-sos, namely, a cure. And not just one cure, but the one cure. But in yersining for a cure, they only prolong the misery of their so-called patients, or more precisely, their clients. Indeed, the cure for which these psycho-so-and-sos yearn is often worse than the misery it's designed to address. Hence, yersining. We yearn for something worse than the misery before us. The dilemma here, if you ask me, is 100% discursive. Note how Lacan sets this up in Television. It's a fiery and kind of enigmatic passage, but only because of some of the shit written in the margins, it seems to me. So, presumably there's a question asked here. Now, we got to remember, this is a complete rewrite. Go look at the French transcript of the actual interview, and you'll see how different some of these questions are. It's kind of ridiculous what this questioner is made into in the French and now English rewrite. Here's how it begins. Section 3, page 13 of Television. The questioner asks Lacan, the psychologists, the psychotherapists, the psychiatrists, all the mental health workers, it's the rank and file, those who are roughing it, who are taking all the burdens of the world's misery onto their shoulders. And the analyst, meanwhile? There's your question. I read it in that voice to further encourage you to please go back and consult the original French transcript, so you can truly see the quality of this interviewer's contributions, not in the rewrite, but in the recording as transcribed. Here's how Lacan responds. One thing is certain. To take the misery onto one's shoulders, as you put it, is to enter into the discourse that determines it, even if only in protest. The question now arises, what kind of discourse are we talking about here? The suggestion in the margin notes, thanks Miller, is that of the master. And you even see this in the French transcription, too. There's a little insert in there suggesting it's a discourse of the master. But notice how Lacan himself spins this out. The psycho so-and-sos, of whatever sort they may be, busying themselves at your supposed burdening, oughtn't to be protesting, but collaborating. Whether they know it or not, that's what they're doing. It's rather convenient, though I may be offering an easy means of retaliation against myself, all too convenient, this idea of discourse, for reducing judgment to its determinants. I'm struck by the way in which they actually find nothing better to oppose me with. Intellectualism, they say. This carries no weight when one wants to know who's right. Even less, and this is the key part, because in relating this misery to the discourse of the capitalist, I denounce the latter. Page 13, beginning of section 3, television. Now, whether Lacan, in this first flourish of discourse, is referring to that of the master, as Miller suggests in his margin note, or whether he's referring to that of the capitalist, as Lacan suggests just a few lines later, I'm not interested in that debate, and frankly, I don't think it really matters. Whether the client, that client, shows up as a master or a capitalist, they demand a cure. The master client commands the therapist to produce one. That's what you see in S1 to S2 to little a. I'll cue up a different color here so we can draw it a little more clearly. S1 to S2 to A is the analysand commanding the analyst to cough up a cure, and precisely for the analysand's surplus enjoyment. And that is exactly what you see in the return arrow from little a to S1. Patient to doctor, give me a fucking cure that I can take home and tell my wife about. That's what we're dealing with here when the master shows up in your consulting room. What about the capitalist? Let's assume that we want to trust Lacan instead of Miller here and think that the discourse in question is indeed that of the capitalist. The capitalist client shows up with a cure of their own in mind, even if only in the name of what they believe ails them. And they expect the therapist to sign off or say the disorder differently. That's one way to read this. The client shows up with a cure in mind, there's your S1, and addresses it to the analyst or the therapist, the psycho so-and-so, all too often, and says, I'd like you to sign off on this. Wouldn't you say that it is indeed anxiety? I asked ChatGPT and it told me generalized anxiety. Although, it's been acute anxiety recently, which is why I've started playing the harmonica. I find that my panic attacks are so much better when I keep a harmonica in my pocket, just in case. Heavy breathing comes on, put a harmonica in your mouth and see how it goes. This is the kind of idiotic shit that you might hear come up. I quip, but I'm trying to capture the point here. The master demands that you produce the cure. The capitalist shows up with one in mind and asks you to sign off on it. And again, for their surplus enjoyment. Hence, once more, that return vector from little a. An enjoyment which always ends in disappointment when the client shows up as a capitalist. In either case, master or capitalist, when the therapist enters into either of these discourses with the person sitting in the chair across the room from them, they become what Lacan rightly describes here as a collaborator. Even if the therapist enters these discourses as a protester, which is one way to read their function in the capitalist discourse, they wind up in a collaborative, unproductive spot because way too fruitful in its results. The consulting room in these instances becomes like a game show. Name that disorder. Name that characterological abnormality. Name this desire. No, name that desire. All of which, of course, ends in the same final round, the same concluding session, indeed the same bonus round in the spirit of surplus enjoyment. And the bonus round is called Name That Cure. On page 5 of Television, at the start of section 2, Lacan gives us a word for name gaming of this sort in the consulting room. It's a word you've heard me use before and one that applies very well here. It's a form of linguistery, or as I like it, linguist trickery. Let me explain what I mean, and I want to try and do this in 5 quick points. Listen, pause, play, listen, pause, play. 5 points to put this one down. Speaking beings, and only speaking beings, have an unconscious. That is point 1. Point 2. The unconscious speaks through these beings. Third, its medium, the medium of the unconscious, is the human form, is the body. And it's a body carved up, as Lacan tells us here, by language. Fourth point. Its effect is a symptomatic statement. And the contours of this effect, fifth point, are linguistic. Here it is in a word. Through the divided body, in the form of sayings turn saids, and with the content of la langue. This is how the unconscious speaks, or at least the part of it that can. I'll say it again, because I think this is pretty damn important and summative of what's happening at the start of television. Through the divided body, in the form of sayings turn saids, and with the content of la langue. This is how the unconscious speaks, at least the part of it that can. If language is what we purport to know about la langue, linguistery, linguist trickery, is how we establish and sustain this epistemic mirage in and beyond the clinic. Instead of holding a place for knowledge, for the unknown and unknowable types of knowledge that we're dealing with here, that ain't how it goes. Instead of holding a place in the linguistery that we have as knowledge for what is unknown and fundamentally unknowable, these other fields of knowledge, instead of holding a place in our epistemologies for the unknown and the unknowable, read the unconscious, indeed that which relative to knowledge remains impossible, what do? Instead of holding a place in knowledge for the unknown and fundamentally unknowable, and to this extent impossible, we open the DSM in search of a name. Call it a disorder, call it a cure. The point here is that all these psycho so-and-sos, analysts astray as well, never stop calling it. Come here, dear name, I want you. This is what Edison said to Watson on the world's first telephone call. So much the worse for the real. Remember, holding a place for desire in your clinic is important. but it's not your fundamental task, dear Lacanians. According to Lacan, and you'd know this if you'd studied III-IVa, which you haven't. I'm just kidding. A lot of you have because you were there and we read it together. I have proof that a lot of you have. And I know you ain't alone. But damn, this essay is so good. And damn if I don't want to emphasize once more, if you haven't read this thing, dig in. We got a whole series to help you through it. Because according to Lacan in III-IVa, the fundamental task of the analyst is not to hold a place for desire, but instead to hold a place for the real. But just until something better comes along. Find that passage, you'll see what I mean. How to do this, you ask? How to hold a place for the real in the consulting room? Well, first, stop by dropping all that linguistery of yours. Shut your mouth and listen for some of them la-la-las instead. Behind the symptom is a song. Just don't mistake it for music. Because it's bird song, it's whale song, it's the song of the cicadas. Do you hear that? Crickets. The medium of psychoanalysis, hear me now, it ain't speech. The medium of psychoanalysis is the crickets between our words. The subject of the unconscious as a figure of castration, as an index of the real, is not linguistic. It's la-la-linguistic, if you will. But again, don't mistake what you just heard for music. Now, thankfully, you're not in risk of mistaking my la-la-la-linguistic as anything like music. But my point is, hear the song without hearing music. That's the trick. La-la-la is neither verse nor chorus, and there's nothing lyrical about the long that la-la-la-long embodies. Poultry, poetry. Listen to how they sound and let go of what you think I just said. Fuck that noise, I hear you reply. I'm here to interpret. I'm an analyst. So you are. And so you yerson on, in search of codes and signals to decipher, leaving noise to be fucked. Like all that static between your favorite radio stations. Or maybe not. Not for you. Not for your analyst. Not for the analyst you hope to become, a Lacanian analyst. Maybe this ain't you. Maybe you've got what it takes to become the saint. You know what this requires, though, don't you? Lacan's been telling you since Seminar 17. He's been telling you ever louder since Seminar 19. In order to hear those stupid la-la-las, you must first become them. Remember that divine mystery supreme that Gandhi used to rail on about? In psychoanalysis, specifically Lacanian psychoanalysis, we learned that it's about waste, trash, detritus, all that noise and static of spoken discourses. The crickets that we typically tune out in search of signals and codes instead. Say what you will about the ancient Greeks. They knew the divine of the cicada. So let's ask the question again. How to hold a place for the real in analytic experience, but just until something better comes along. How exactly does the psychoanalyst, the properly Lacanian analyst, hold a place for the real just until something better comes along? The same way Lacan's been telling us since the end of Seminar 19, or worse, as abjection. And this is where things get good. Note, in the analytic discourse on your screen, that is not object little a in the upper left-hand corner. It is instead abject little a. Lacan is still hot on this topic at the start of television, and it's exactly where he turns after bemoaning all those psycho so-and-sos. In our translation, it's on page 15. So let's turn to the psychoanalyst, from the psycho so-and-sos to the psychoanalyst, and not beat around the bush. Though what I'm going to say is to be found under that bush just as well, because there is no better way of placing him objectively than in relation to what was in the past called being a saint. You want to know how Lacan thinks of the psychoanalyst in 1973? He thinks of them in terms of sainthood. During his life, a saint doesn't command the respect that a halo sometimes gets for him. No one notices him as he follows Balthazar Gracian's way of life, that of renouncing personal brilliance, something that explains why Amelot de la Houssea thought he was writing about the courtier. Check it out. Here's the key part. A saint's business, to put it clearly, is not caritas. Rather, he acts as trash. His business being trashitas, so as to embody what the structure entails, namely allowing the subject of the unconscious, to take him as the cause of the subject's own desire. Trashitas over caritas. This is the motto of Lacanian psychoanalysis in 1973. Or at least it should have been the motto. This is just a passing blip, but it captures so much of what Lacan has been doing since the end of Seminar 19b or worse forward. Trashitas over caritas. Put that in your divine mystery supreme. Waste, not lack. This is the object turned abject cause of desire. Waste, not lack. I think there are two key takeaways here, both clinical and conceptual throughout. First and foremost, I think we get another way to work the analytic discourse here, from S2 to abject little a to the barred subject. And here we can draw it again with the green so that you can see the direction I'm talking about here. We haven't talked much about this S2 to little a to /s, but here we're getting another way to read it. What you see here from S2 to abject little a to the barred subject is S2 being not the analyst's knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, but instead the unconscious truth of which the analysand, no matter how well hystericized, remains profoundly ignorant. Let me be clear. The unconscious in this rereading is not a fucking gold mine. It is a trash dump. Indeed, it is a pile of waste, a pile of shit, even. This is what the analyst as abject little a embodies. Between the analysand and their impregnable unconscious, their real unconscious, as Lacan may indeed go on to argue, we'll see, there's not just a third. Between S2 and /S, there is not just a third element in the figure of abjection. There is not just a third, but what I would add, a little whimsically, a turd. That's the analyst for you, especially at the end of a neurotics treatment. Not just a third wheel, but a little pile of turds. We started with thirdness. We are now arriving at turdness. Second key takeaway here. With this shift from thirds to turds comes the second key takeaway. And I think this one's the biggie. Lacan now thinks of object little a as abject little a. I've been telling you this since our series on Seminar 19. In television, boy has arrived at this thought. You've been hearing this from me for a while, in other words. But now, in television, this transformation from object little a to abject little a is damn near complete. I quote from page 21 of our translation, and I encourage you to go back and consult the French as well. Abject is what I have come to call my object petit a, Lacan plainly says on page 21 of television. Abject is what I have come to call my object petit a. Note the emphasis in our English translation even on petit a. Here, it's a homonym. We learn from footnote 9. It's a homonym with petita, meaning, for all the French speakers and listeners out there, little pile. Petita sounds exactly like petit a. Objet petit a is now object little pile. Petita. And it's no coincidence that Lacan is making this move. And it's no coincidence that it's coming up, note this, in a fleeting recollection of Seminar 10 on anxiety, because it's here in the early 1960s that Lacan began his shift from object little a to abject little a. I'm not saying it was apparent there, but I think looking back that it's in the early 1960s, precisely in Seminar 10, that object little a begins the transformation which we are now seeing complete into abject little a. What does this mean for psychoanalysis? It means that, like a good saint, the Lacanian psychoanalyst, and Lacan wasn't one, mind you, he was a Freudian, and anything but a saint. Like a good saint, but unlike Lacan, the Lacanian psychoanalyst knows how to play the part of refuse, how to be that petita, that little pile. Specifically, as Lacan puts it on page 16 of television, the refuse of jouissance. It's a wonderful and suggestive characterization. Now, at the risk of losing sight of what really matters here, I might offer this as a characterization to help us make sense of this refuse of jouissance. The type of jouissance in question here is the same we see in therapies gone astray, especially when the analysand's hystericization appears to know no end. The jouissance in question here is surplus jouissance, the refuse of surplus enjoyment. This is what the analyst is also able to embody. That little abject A in the analytic discourse is the clinical refuse of surplus enjoyment. Which brings us to the more important point, the one I don't want to lose sight of by offering this little bit of caption on that refuse of jouissance expression. When the analyst assumes the position of abject little a, they allow the analysand's unconscious to take them, the analyst, as the cause of the analysand's own desire. That's what Lacan tells us in the passage that we considered. But note the shift here. You've often heard, and rightly so, that the cause of desire is lack. Here, on page 15 of Television, Lacan is pivoting from lack to waste, from the experience of having lost something to the object that's experienced as lost. And he's telling us that it's not a prized and precious object, indeed, fuck your agalma, but instead an abject pile of shit. Not something thrown before us, abjecere, recall the Latin, but something thrown away from us, abjecere. Jacere is the Latin meaning to throw, and ab means against or in front of. The object is what's thrown in front of you for consideration. What is abject, though? Ab means away or from. To abjecere is to throw away from oneself. That's why abjection is so wonderfully used to describe trash. It's something that you throw away. The object is what is put in front of you for consideration, for deliberation, and the like. The abject is what you would like to cast aside. Abjecare. Let me explain how all this hangs together. If you focus on the object cause of desire, you're going to focus on the centrality and presence of lack. In matters of desire, we're always confronted, abjecere, with the experience of lack. That's a fine insight, but it is hardly a final one. Because when you shift your attention to the abject cause of desire instead, as Lacan is advising us here in Television, you now are focused not on the centrality and presence of lack, but on the periphery of lack, on what is absented by its presence. And not absented exactly, but more precisely excluded, rejected, cast aside, and thus degraded. The experience in question here is not lack, but its predecessor, loss. The abject cause of desire is the experience of loss that precedes the experience of lack, which is the object cause of desire. Put that on a t-shirt. And one that you find very familiar and ready to wear. Why? Because you've heard all this shit for a long time from me. I offer some simple math once more. Phi minus phi equals little a. Ta-da! This was one of those 1 minus 1 does indeed equal 0 formulas that we worked up in so many earlier series. But note the crucial difference here. What's lost in order to experience lack is no longer something we wish we still had. Like I said, fuck your agalma. It's not something that we wish we still had. It's not something we long to reacquire. What's lost here is something we are glad to be rid of, and all too happy to leave where it is, in the trash with all the other refuse of lived experience. Let me be clear. we are not talking about the lost object here. Instead, we are talking about an experience of abjection lost. What is the experience of abjection that we're all too happy to be rid of here? In a word, castration. In some more words, the unary trait, the no of the father, symbolic alienation, that minus phi in the minus phi that you see on your screen right now. Phi minus phi equals object little a. Call it what you will, but only so long as you call it castration, and I'll be happy. This is how the analyst shows up when they assume the position of abject little a in the analytic discourse, as a semblance of castration, as an embodiment of precisely what the analysand would like to avoid. Not the object cause of their desire, namely lack, but the abject cause of their lack, namely loss. And note again, this is not the loss they've been desperate to recover all these years. Instead, it's the loss they've been content to ignore, often even passionately so. We could go on about all this, and I expect we will in our next full-length series on Seminar 21, the title of which really says it all. But for now, in our reading of television, we can leave it at that, because we now know what trashitas over caritas means. Trashitas over caritas means that the analyst holds a place for the real by becoming an embodiment of abjection lost. In short, an embodiment of castration, in and through which the analysand can trace their unconscious desire to its root cause. A root cause which is fundamentally, as Lacan says in television, the abjection of this cause. One petit tas at a time. And don't forget, when I say petit tas, I don't mean little a, I mean little pile. From lack to waste. From the binary digital sequences of the symbolic to entropic, abject piles of the real. This is the transition whose completion we are witnessing in television. This is the transition from object little a to abject little a, whose completion we are witnessing in television. Whether you can laugh at this is another question. Can you laugh at this? Can you laugh with the saint over this? We gotta learn, because according to Lacan, this is our only way out of the capitalist discourse, whether you're an analyst or not. It should be easy, right? Levitas over gravitas. Isn't this right? Real turds are light. They're not heavy. Gandhi's mortician probably knew as much. Indeed, Gandhi was easy to shoulder at the end, wouldn't you say? There's a dark bit of humor in there somewhere, but it would take a saint to find it. And that sure as fuck ain't me.